And so, before turning to the case of Julian Assange, spycatcher, WikiLeaks and the role of the internet, it's worth reflecting that the cause for which we stand and when we must fight is freedom itself. It was also a fundamental part of our jurisprudence that a court would not restrain the publication of confidence if their disclosure would reveal the commission of crimes and unlawful acts. Iniquities was the term used. And it's worth remembering too, in this context, the words of the US Supreme Court Justice Black in the Pentagon Papers case. This is the Daniel Ellsberg case. And I quote, "The guarding of military and diplomatic secrets at the expense of informed representative government provides no real security for our republic. The framers of the First Amendment, fully aware of both the need to defend a new nation and the abuses of the English and colonial governments, sought to give this new society strength and security by providing that freedom of speech, press, religion and assembly should not be abridged." The High Court was very clear in declaring that an Australian court should not act to protect the intelligence secrets and confidential political information of a foreign government, even one which was a very friendly one, and even in circumstances where the Australian government requested the court to do so. And that was really the point that Lawrence Street had argued that the executive government could open the door to an Australian court to provide protection to a foreign government in this regard, and that was rejected correctly, in my view, by everybody else. Now, I stress this point because it has a current relevance to the case of Julian Assange, who you will remember our Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, described as someone who had broken the law acted illegally by publishing the contents of confidential US State Department cables. Not only was it perfectly obvious that Mr Assange had broken no Australian law, and despite the strenuous efforts of the Americans, there is no evidence to date that he's broken any American ones, but the decision of the High Court in Spycatcher makes it quite clear that any action in an Australian court to restrain Mr Assange from publishing the State Department cables would have failed. These remarks by the Prime Minister, which were echoed by her Attorney-General, were particularly regrettable, not simply because she was so obviously in error from a legal point of view, but whatever one may think of Mr Assange, whatever Julia Gillard may think of Mr Assange, he is, after all, an Australian citizen. More importantly, perhaps, at the time he was being described as a criminal, in effect, by Ms Gillard, prominent American politicians and journalists were describing him as a terrorist and, in some cases, and this is remarkable but it's a fact, calling for him to be assassinated. Sarah Palin, possibly the next US president, did not go quite that far. She called for him to be pursued, and I quote, "with the same urgency we pursue al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders," unquote. No doubt her supporters were able to read whatever they liked into that remark. Now, while Mr Assange is no doubt, I trust, quite safe from assassination, when an Australian citizen is spoken of in this way, you could say threatened in this way, an Australian Prime Minister should respond. Julia Gillard could have quite properly, perhaps should have quite properly, deplored his publishing of confidential information, and it was not unreasonable of her to describe him as irresponsible. She could have sympathised with our embarrassed American allies, but at the same time registered our profound unhappiness that an Australian citizen is being spoken of in this way, described as a terrorist, called to be put down by leading figures in another country whose commitment to freedom of speech and the rule of law we traditionally regard as being no less than our own. She might have even taken the time to ask how on earth the United States security arrangements were so slack that hundreds of thousands of highly confidential documents could be copied onto a disk by a 23-year-old US Army private, Bradley Manning. After all, let there be no mistake, Mr Assange would not have been the subject of this kind of attack had he been an American, let alone an American journalist. Can you imagine one of Mr Rupert Murdoch's employees at Fox News calling for the assassination of an editor at the Washington Post or the New York Times? What if the US State Department cables had been published by the Wall Street Journal or Fox News itself? Do you imagine that Congressman Pete King, then the incoming chair of the House Homeland Security Committee would have called for News Corporation to be declared a foreign terrorist organisation or compare Mr Murdoch to Osama bin Laden. And what of Prime Minister Gillard? She was more than happy to label Mr Assange a criminal, someone who was acting illegally, breaking the law. But I didn't hear her describe the editors of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald in those terms when they published the contents of the State Department cables given them by WikiLeaks. So it's easy for politicians in the midst of a media frenzy to jump onto the bandwagon and compete to denounce the villain of the hour, especially if he or she is seen as vulnerable or lacking in the power associated with great vested interests in the media. But leadership, and in particular national leadership, requires cooler heads. Mr Assange's conduct may be misguided, even reprehensible, but no Australian Prime Minister should accuse one of her own citizens of breaking the law, of being a criminal, when there has not even been a charge, let alone a conviction.